This is the New Revolution Objective 2 about the cultural revolutions that happened in the 1960s that were not necessarily about the civil rights movement. That's a whole separate topic altogether. But if you take a look at this picture here, you'll notice that this is when the decade, if you're familiar with hippies and the protest movement and all that stuff like that, this is the decade when all that basically happens. And if you take a look at letter A on the outline, it says there that the 50s had under the surface issues that no one wanted to talk about. Well, they did. I mean, women were slowly building into a feminist movement in the late 50s. The civil rights movement was starting to pick up steam in the late 50s. The beat movement against conformity was starting to pick up in the late 50s. Well, in the 1960s, that's all going to boil over. Now, one thing I want you to jot down on the side here is that the decade starts fairly well with the election of John F. Kennedy because of his youth and his optimism. But it's Kennedy's death that is going to change everything. After Kennedy dies, things start coming apart at the seams. Take a look at the things that were going on for women during that particular time. If you look at letter B here, the idea of a birth control pill being introduced is automatically going to turn 1950s conservative culture on its head. The idea that you could have sex whenever you wanted to and control whether or not you wanted to have a baby was something that in the 1950s would have been completely taboo to even discuss. And it also starts this process in the 50s of people, it was called the free love movement, of people who were essentially being much less careful sexually. Now, the book itself, The Feminine Mystique, isn't really about that, though, if you look at B2. It's about Betty Friedan, who's a housewife. She was really getting tired of living in the house, and she was piggybacking on the feminist revolution that had started in the late 50s. Well, this book right here, The Feminine Mystique, is going to be basically the Bible of the feminist movement. It was a national bestseller, just kind of crying out for help for women. As a result, in the 1950s, if you go down farther under B there, Betty Friedan, that's her in the middle of the picture here, helps to start the National Organization of Women. And also which I can't remember, it was some long acronym about women and terrorism and from hell and all this other stuff. It was actually in the book. Protest the Miss America pageant in 1968. Now, what they were doing was standing out at the boardwalk at Atlantic City and throwing bras into trash cans and putting the Miss America label on a sheep and leading the sheep around. The idea was, stand up for yourself as women. And other groups as well were standing up for themselves. If you take a look at number 4, homosexuals were standing up for gay rights a lot more in the 1960s than they had in the Medici Society of the 1950s. But now they're starting to get in some trouble for that. If you take a look, the Stonewall Rebellion is about, this is one of the protest parades in response to the Stonewall Rebellion, where 2 gay men were almost beaten to death by off-duty police officers. But other areas were starting to kind of come unglued from the 1950s as well. Back in the 50s, there were just certain things you could not say and would not say on television or in public, things that were kept behind closed doors and kept private. Well, take a look at letter C here. This group, Students for a Democratic Society, and also a group out in California called the Free Speech Movement, try to turn that on its head. This is a movement against all the censorship values of the 1950s. Now, something to note here about Students for a Democratic Society and all this stuff, a lot of the 60s liberal left-wing protest, all that stuff, a lot of that happened at the University of Michigan and got started there. Students for a Democratic Society, which became a national organization, starts at the University of Michigan. And while they're there, they basically draft a constitution of principles called the Port Huron Statement. That's named after Port Huron, Michigan. Okay. Now, out west in California, something very similar was happening at the University of California, Berkeley. Now, just to jot this on the side so you have a rough idea of geography, that's in the San Francisco area, which was also the prime area of the counterculture that we talk about later. Now, in 1964, they wanted to have some political debates on campus, but the school rules did not allow that. So since the administration had banned political debate on the campus, the students decided to take on the movement for themselves. They met in front of Sprawl Hall, which you can see here in the background. This is all Sprawl Hall is a very famous hall in college folklore now because it's where a lot of protests have happened over the years. Berkeley becomes a very protest-laden campus. But the very first one there was for free speech. You can see the crowd gathering here as the movement got very, very big. Eventually, here's something I want you to be aware of on the side as well. Eventually, these students go into Sprawl Hall and take it over and sit there until the police come. The protest ended up being successful, and the administration met the student body to let them know that they would have free speech on campus. So you have the women's movement, you have the free speech movement, and then if you take a look at letter D, there's a whole other movement called the Counterculture Movement. Now, this was, in this image, the society, mainstream society that people had known in the 1950s and in the first 2 or 3 years of the 1960s. Very conservative, hanging around the television, no long hair, at least on the men, that type of thing. Well, in the late 1960s, it basically turned into this. This is what you would basically know today as, a lot of people would call it hippie culture or counterculture. It was called the counterculture because it was the counter to mainstream culture. Now, if you take a look at D1 here, most of these were kids who had grown up in the 50s and had been fairly privileged and fairly spoiled, and then they get out and, and this isn't all of them, but a lot of them. They were pretty colorful. Basically, if it was anything about 1950 society, they did just the opposite. The 50s was very gray, the counterculture was very colorful. 50s was about short hair, facial hair, or no facial hair. The counterculture was about long hair and facial hair. Women stopped wearing bras in the counterculture, and in a lot of cases even stopped shaving their legs and armpits. The idea was whatever 1950s conformist society was, the counterculture would be the opposite. Now, again, something else to jot on the side, if you look at D1B here, usually they were involved in unemployed or low-paying jobs. The idea was it was socialist in a lot of ways. One of the things that became popular in the counterculture was the concept of the Commune, just people living together in a field in tents, sometimes entire families, and somebody might go out and work occasionally, or they'd grow their own food, but everybody kind of took care of each other. It was very Karl Marx, it was very communist in a lot of different ways, or very pro-socialist in a lot of different ways. And as you might imagine in that situation, drug use became very prevalent. Marijuana was the most common, followed closely by LSD, which was psychedelic and made you have hallucinations. Counterculture was also very big into peace and love and the peace movement. A lot of times they were referred to as flower children. Here, a protester, it was a very common sight to see protesters sticking flowers in the barrels of guns whenever soldiers were lined up somewhere at a riot or whatever the case may be. And the counterculture was very big into the environment because they were very big into Native American spiritualism. And if you remember, Native American religion was about the idea that the sky is the father of all things, the earth is the mother of all things, and that everything on the planet is a spiritual brother if it's a living thing in some way, shape, or form. Well, Native Americans and the counterculture were both very big into the spiritualist concept. And finally, you can't really talk about the counterculture without the idea of the sexual revolution and free love movements. When things are this open and this permissible, you're going to have a lot of situations where two people go off into the middle of a field and maybe don't even know each other's names and spend an afternoon together without saying much. And that was not that uncommon either. So there's the women's movement that's kind of turning attitudes about women from the 50s on their heads. There's the free speech movement that's kind of turning attitudes about censorship of the 50s on its head. There's the counterculture, which is basically taking the whole idea of the man in the gray flannel suit and girdles and conservative ways of looking at things culturally in the 50s and turning that on its head. And then you have the anti-war protest movement. Now, we started getting involved in the Vietnam War as early as the 1950s with advisors. But in 1965, we put troops on the ground in Vietnam, and that's something I want you to jot on the side. 1965 is when Lyndon Johnson put troops in Vietnam to actually do a lot more of the fighting. Well, the anti-war protest movement didn't like that. The number one thing they didn't like, and this isn't in the outline, so jot this down, is that they didn't understand what we were doing there. We were there to contain communism. But a lot of Americans didn't understand why we needed to contain communism or why we needed to fight in Vietnam's Civil War. They hadn't done anything to us was the basic mantra. What made it even more difficult is that more and more guys were getting killed as we kept drafting troops and sending them into somebody else's civil war. A lot of people saw it as your patriotic duty to go. Other people were questioning why we were there, and in the 1960s, everything could be questioned. One of the things that became a real issue was the fact that all college-bound high school graduates were exempt from the draft. If you were going to college, then you didn't have to go. They wanted to keep you here. But if you were too poor to go to college or didn't have the grades to go to college or were going into a trade school, then you were on your way. Now, of course, that meant a lot of poor whites, and that meant a lot of minorities in the inner cities that didn't get the same educational opportunities that a lot of other people had. So you started seeing protests like this as people started to claim that Vietnam was turning into a race war and a war against the poor, because really minorities and the poor were really at first the only ones going. It also didn't help that we found out the American government was being less than truthful about how well we were doing. A lot of times they would use body counts and say, we've killed way more than the enemy than they've killed of us. But the problem with that is that they were inflating the numbers. They were trying to make it look like we were doing better in the war than we were doing. And once people found that out, that led to a lot of other protests as well. Bottom line, if you look at E5 here, circle these numbers. 58,000 people died in Vietnam, but almost as many dodged the draft. 50,000 found ways to get out of the draft by going to other countries. Letter B here, this was called, and jot this on the side, this was called a conscientious objector, meaning that you had to prove that you were refusing because of freedom of thought, your conscience, or your religious beliefs wouldn't allow you to fight. And other people just wanted to establish they had mental illnesses. There were quite a few people that got drafted and showed up for their physical wearing nothing but women's underwear and acting homosexual because they thought that would make the military figures uncomfortable and get them out of being drafted. Now, one thing we want to touch on here is how the music of the time period kind of reflected the time period. And the 60s starts pretty calm with surf rock like the Beach Boys. Eventually, as the counterculture movement becomes bigger, you're going to start seeing folk music done by Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and other people like that. Eventually, that's going to turn into folk rock. And once the anti-war protest movement gets going, you're going to start seeing all sorts of different types of protest music. This is a really fascinating topic for individual study if you ever decide you want to do that. And the 60s wouldn't be the 60s, particularly in Michigan, if we weren't talking about the Motown rhythm and blues movement. Here are the Supremes. You've probably heard of Diana Ross. She's over here on the left. And Smokey Robinson as well. And the 60s is also what brought us the British invasion of rock and roll from England to the United States. And the British invasion, generally you're talking about two groups. The Beatles have become very big. Here they're on the Ed Sullivan Show getting ready to perform. And the Rolling Stones, who were considered basically a raunchier version of the Beatles. And depending on your taste, a lot of people like them even better. As drug use became more prevalent in the late 60s, LSD, other psychedelic drugs that made you see kind of strange things, became more popular in society among the counterculture. Guys like Jimi Hendrix singing about purple haze, all in my brain. You know, that's meant to be talking about psychedelic drugs. Jimi Hendrix becomes popular, and the Doors, led by their frontman Jim Morrison. A lot of groups were really turning to the psychedelic side of things by the end of the decade.